I think for trans and gender expansive folks, I would want them to take away that you are standing in a great cloud of witnesses, as we would put it in the church. That you are not alone in what you are going through. You are not alone in your identity, and you are not alone in Christian history. You're not alone in, like, your spiritual ancestors are with you, and for you to be part of that larger picture and to be part of that larger community means that you are not expendable, and that you are important, and that you can base your trust on something very real. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation.
Friends, what is up? It's leowt here with another episode of Conversations. It's up to you guys to figure out whether I left my office since my last video or if I just wear this shirt a lot. We'll let the public decide on that one. But we are in fact here for another episode of Conversations. In case this is your first time tuning in, Conversations is a safe space to have intersectional conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. And the single most important tenet of Conversations is that everybody has agency and a voice at the table. So that's what we do. I'm leowt. I'm a hairdresser. I'm a theology student, and I'm a non-binary person of trans experience. So I have a little bit of skin invested in the conversation today. And what we're actually going to be talking about is trans theology and the fact that trans people don't simply get to sneak into the back row of the church, but actually the church needs us more than we need the church. And my wonderful new friend here is going to join in because he's quite literally written the book on this. So I'm going to let him introduce himself. Austin, you can take it away.
Hi, friends. My name's Austen Hartke. I'm so excited to be here today. So I'm so excited I can't speak. I'm so excited to be part of this conversation because it is so important. I wrote, I guess I would say, a book on this. There's many other good ones, especially now, but I wrote a book called Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, and that came out in 2014 now. So we are coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the book, which is very exciting. Or it came out in 2018, sorry. So the 5-year anniversary is coming up soon, which is very exciting. I also am the executive director of an organization called Transmission Ministry Collective, which is basically a online support organization for transgender and gender expansive Christians. And so we have support groups and workshops and Bible studies and all kinds of stuff for folks online. And so getting to be part of getting to talk about this kind of stuff, getting to talk about trans theology is one of my favorite things. And so I'm really glad to be here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Conversations is kind of funny. Conversations started actually over 10 years ago, and we were in person. What we did was, my goal was to have a church that I would want to go to, but that doesn't necessarily feel like church. And so we met regularly and intentionally to just literally have conversations. And we would start with, I would facilitate what was called like a jumping off point. And we would just either watch a little bit of a documentary, read a little bit of a book, or take a news article and just talk about it intentionally. And it ended up being like myself and then a bunch of lesbians, which was dope. It was pre-transition for me. And so it was just like me and my friends, basically. But we had a critical mass of about 30 to 40 people weekly. We served monthly at our local soup kitchen, and we went abroad yearly to do some like house building stuff. So it was really successful, and there was never one point where we were like, this is our theological position. It was just to have intentional intersectional conversations. But because of COVID and life changes, here we are 10 years later, and we're doing that same online thing too. So I think it's really valid because when you're talking about trans people, we're statistically 10% of the population or less, right? So we're likely to be far flung. And so I think honestly, COVID was beneficial in that way, that it sort of strengthened a lot of these online platforms. So
totally, yeah. Being able to find each other online. Yeah. I mean, that's always been a thing for marginalized folks, since the beginning of the internet, right? But it's been interesting to watch how that has changed over the past 10 years, where it's it started on like message boards, and
Mhm.
like when I was coming out early on in transition, it was like everybody was posting their transition on YouTube, and like that was a big thing. And like now we have so many different ways of connecting. And I think especially in the last 2 years with COVID, we've gotten really good at figuring out how to do like small group conversations and stuff over Zoom and whatever. And so yeah, the internet, it's one of those double-edged swords, but I'm really glad for the ways that it's connected people.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's actually a statistic too out there from the LGBTQ Rural Map that they basically took data from a bunch of other surveys, and they came up with the statistic that there are between 2.8 and 3.9 million queer Americans in rural America. But the problem with that is that we're all spread out. And so it's not that we're not here, it's just that we're not visible. And I think
Yeah.
visibility on the internet is translating into visibility in real life because people feel supported, right?
Totally. And like the other thing then is like, what is the access of high-speed internet in rural areas, like so like
Yes.
even when we're talking about the internet, like we have folks that are in Transmission Ministry Collective who are in rural spaces who are like, well, I can use Discord and whatever, but like my internet's not strong enough to be like on Zoom all the time because I'm just like the whole time. So like how do we help with like structural things like that? It's a big question.
Absolutely. I was lucky enough to give a speech to a local consortium of guidance counselors about a month ago on the topic of rural trans youth and the intersection of poverty and mental health issues in rural trans youth. And I
Mm,
think that there's so many things that go into that people don't realize. And it's a co-occurring factor, right, of all of
yep.
these things that affects life. And that's why I think intersectional conversation is so important, because if you just look at one of those factors, you're going to still miss a whole nother section of that population.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So who are you and how did you come to this work? Give us the Cliff Notes version if you want, or dive in, totally up to you. But what brought you to the point of writing this book and doing the Transmission Collective and all of that?
Yeah, so what brought me to it? I guess the short Cliff Notes version is I grew up non-denom in like evangelical spaces, and it was really, really focused on the Bible. Like that was like, the center of everything was the Bible and like scripture memorization, and like that was the focus of everything. And like the Bible had something to say about every part of your life. And I grew up in that sort of place. When I was a teenager, I kind of had this like pushback against Christianity, which I think many people do as teenagers, or kind of recognizing like a lot of the hypocrisy and a lot of the things that don't match, the not walking the talk, and especially seeing how Christians in general that like I knew of treated queer folks, and seeing the sort of the I don't know, all of the bad stuff that comes with that. We're queer folks. We know how this works, right? Like we've seen this, and seeing that as a teenager I was coming to understand my own queerness when it came to like sexuality and orientation. I was like, now hang on a second, like this doesn't jive. I don't like this. And so for me, I went through a long period in my young adulthood of like trying to figure out, could I reconcile those two things, which I think is a big thing that lots of folks have to go through. Like, how do I make sense of this? And for me, it always was wrapped up in scripture and in the Bible because of that priority in my early faith life. And so I ended up going to seminary because I was like, seminary, they will have all the answers to all of my questions, right? Which is not how seminary works.
No, it's not.
At all. And so I kind of thought like, I'll go and I'll find out, I need to find out how to make sense of this. I kind of had figured it out a little bit for myself, but I was still really interested in, especially, I think the one thing that really was like, hang on, I want to investigate this was, I was really into reading about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, because those were the passages, like all the passages that were sort of used against queer folks were, not all of them, but a majority of them are in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And so that there was this kind of connection where people were like, we have this idea of like Old Testament angry God, and then we have like New Testament loving God, and like Jesus comes and fixes all that bad stuff. And that was kind of like the general sense of the theology that I'd gotten as a young person.
Right.
And as I got older, I met Jewish folks, and I found like Jewish communities that were so much more affirming of LGBTQ plus folks that I was like, now hang on, this doesn't make sense. Like if this is the part of the Bible that is like the super non-affirming part,
Right.
and this is the part that like is most important to you folks, how are you more affirming? So it kind of like, it really made me curious. And so when I got to seminary, I started out in youth and family ministry, and then very quickly realized that like what I wanted to do was just study the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And so that was really my area of focus. And while I was in seminary, and it was during the time that I was in seminary that I started sort of like unwrapping all the layers around my own gender identity. And so it really became a personal thing. And I know that you've talked before about like multiple coming out moments in your life.
Yes.
And so for me, it was like, I had to do that same thing where it was like, okay, well, I came out as bisexual as a teenager. Now I'm coming out as trans. It's like a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And it was still so wrapped up in my understanding of God through scripture. And so when I finished seminary, it's like I had done all of this work figuring out like more, or like finding more information about gender expansive experiences and like people outside the gender binary in scripture. And I wanted to make that that information as accessible to people as possible. And so I started making YouTube videos about it because that's where everybody was at the time. I was like, we got to make YouTube videos because like trans folks are on YouTube. And which is like still the case in a huge way. And so I started making videos about it, to which the response was, where can I find more information? And that eventually became the book. And the book then eventually became Transmission Ministry Collective, because after I wrote the book, I had all these people coming to me going, this book is so helpful in thinking about like my gender and my faith, but like, where can I talk with other trans Christians about this? And so that's how Transmission Ministry Collective came about. Right on. So yeah, that's kind of the sort of the Cliff Notes version.
Yeah, no, I love it. I actually, I think I was driving to so I'm a member in discernment, which means I'm in the ordination process for the United Church of Christ. A fancy little paper card on the back of a manila envelope that I signed myself that said, I'm a member in discernment, and it totally proves everything. But I was on the way to my like annual like luncheon where we have to just like do our little song and dance. Like this is what we've done in the past year. And I listened to your book on the way up and then on the way back. So it was like almost a 5-hour drive round trip for me.
Yikes.
But I was listening to it and I was thinking to myself, like, this is fantastic. And I'll have to be honest, because I've like up to my ears in apologetic thought. For those of you who are watching that might know what that means, is apologetics is like finding a way to justify the fact that I just exist, like the bare minimum. And a lot of people base their conversations on queer people in spirituality around just an apologetic of almost like we'll let you in the door because. And so I was not entirely sure if I was ready to listen to your book, because I was like, is this going to be more of what I've already ingested so much of? And like, I'm just at the point where I'm not going to vie for the validity of my existence anymore. I exist, like that's where I'm at. But I love that your book goes beyond, and I don't need an apologetic, but your book shows that A, we've always been here and we're present in scriptures, but also B, like there's really no other reason to keep us subjugated, because not only were we there, but we were integral and we were important, and our existence has just been buried. You know, it's so interesting because last night I filmed a conversation with a new friend who's Native American, and we were talking about Native American issues and Native American sovereignty and how the state of New York is actually currently just extorting the Seneca Nation. But he was saying that one of the biggest things about being Native is that you were never allowed to self-define. Your story was always told by other people. And I feel like that's what a lot of trans people experience when we're just trying to exist. Because, people will be like, okay, well, we're getting okay with gay people, but now trans people, that's a whole nother thing. And I like that your book took the narrative back. Right. And it said, no, we're not just vying for validity. We're saying we were here and important all along. And that way I see a lot of parallels with the conversation I had last night. So was there anything personally revelatory for you in the process of writing this book, or had it like talk to me about writing it and getting it out there as you're coming out?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the work that I do builds upon so many trans scholars. Like Justin Saviatanis wrote what I think of as the book called Transgender. And like his book was the first book that I ever read that was like, hey, let's talk about like let's do the apologetics, but let's go beyond that. Let's talk about like how gender expansive people in scripture are like like our ancestors, and like how they're connected to us today, despite being very different. Like, the one of the arguments that will oftentimes get leveraged against trans folks that are doing biblical work is like, well, these folks are so completely different from us that like you can't draw similarity. And it's like, well, no, of course it's not the same thing, but our similarity in experiences is like so in some way, in so many ways, like so spot on. And so like yeah, that was the first book I think that I first read that was like, whoa. Virginia Ramey Mollenkott, also, like a classic like pioneer of this work. And so there are so many people who wrote really important books before transforming that really helped kind of push me in the right direction. And for me, my experience of like writing the book and like coming around to that theology, like there was about I want to say like a 2-year gap between. So I graduated. The reason I got the year wrong when I was originally talking about transforming is because I graduated from seminary in 2014, and then the book came out in 2018. So there was like a 4-year gap there between like when I graduated and when the book was done, like released. I was writing it in those years, and for me, it was like it had all kind of like started, like I was wrestling with it in seminary, and then it sort of started crystallizing, and writing the book was really like putting all the pieces together. It really felt like kind of finishing a puzzle. And for me, it all centers around like one of the central I think it's actually one of the central chapters in the book, which now that I think about it, I want to go look and see if I can do like a chiasm of like the central part of it for scripture nerds. But anyway, the central part of the book for me is the story in Isaiah of it's not even a story, it's a proclamation in Isaiah 56 that talks about eunuchs and foreigners, is the language that's used, that are welcomed into God's house and that are given this special blessing. And looking at the experiences of eunuchs, these people that were outside of the gender binary of their time, outside of the gender binary of our time, and having this like special blessing for these people who had been sort of cast out. And that to me was like the central part that I looked at and went, that's me, like that's my experience. Seeing God like intentionally welcome in this group of people was so formative for my own personal experience, because it felt like it answered the biggest question that I had, which was like, first, that question of apologetics, can I be here? And secondly, that question of like, is this just like me sliding in the side door, or like, do I actually get to like be my full self? And that passage in Isaiah is like so explicitly affirming that God is going to give these people a special blessing and a special place, not in the sense of like separate but equal, but in the sense of like lifted up. That to me, I don't know, that was like so central to my personal experience. And so when I was writing the book, that was really like where it all kind of came together, was in that story. And like the yeah, I don't know, there was something about that story that really got to me. But the other thing that like has really influenced, and like coming to the point of, one of the points of these conversations that you're having, the intersectionality, like looking at intersecting oppressions and like how we can break those, like how we can I was going to say break those apart, but that doesn't work with the metaphor. How we can take care of like the systemic things that are like pressing people down. Like for me, that bit in Isaiah, it's so important that the eunuchs and the foreigners are linked together in the blessing, because it means that nobody is free until everybody's free, right? And it means that there is a special call, I believe, for gender expansive people to stand with refugees and migrants and immigrants and like these people who are considered foreigners in whatever context. It's like there is a special connection between the two of us that I think we really see in Isaiah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because for me, that was the part I was like listening to your book in audio form while I was driving. And I went back and re-listened to that Isaiah piece because it was a piece of scripture that I hadn't come across before. And I have a minor in the Bible, right? One of my favorite things to do, like on TikTok, I'm kind of like getting well known for just clapping back at just ignorant people with real actual knowledge. And so they're always like, what Bible have you read? And I always point to my bookshelf back there and I'm like, which one? Because there's about 15 Bibles on the shelf back there, but I still hadn't found that story in Isaiah. And I was so blown away by what you were saying. And I liked that it was like voiced by you as well. So
I know I fought for that. I was like, can I please read my own book? I had to convince them to let me do it.
As a trans person, like hearing a trans voice reading trans theological thought to me was really impactful. But I went back and re-listened to that because I do fully believe that there is no freedom for anyone until there's freedom for everyone. And I think it's really interesting because especially with the Black Lives Matter movement that really upticked during COVID, right? I live in small town America and 13,000 people, right? That's it. We're topping out the scales at 13,000 people. And we're the biggest geographic center for an hour and a half to an hour and a 45-minute radius around us. As scary as that is, we're the cultural bastion of Cattaraugus County. And there was a real tension almost when I became involved with the Black Lives Matter movement. Here, there was a local group like sort of coalescing, but nothing really official. And so we tried to come together and take that group and make it something more that would pay forward, you know what I mean? Not just a trending hashtag, but really build something. And I actually ran into a lot of people who said they blatantly wouldn't work with me. And it ended up being a lot of sort of minority religious folks. And I was so bummed out because if you look at the Gospels and if you look at the Hebrew Bible, the outsiders are literally always the ones that were being lifted up and taken care of and spoke about and defended. Like, I like to say that the gospel kind of has like a centrifugal motion to it, right? Like the more the gospel kicks up in gear, the more the gospel it pushes to the margins. Like that's where it matters. Like it's like the gravitron at a county fair.
Right.
Sans the puking from some random stranger.
Exactly, yeah.
But the gospel is always in those margins. And so for me, it's so nonsensical for one marginalized group to look at another and be like, nah, you're outside. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't make sense for marginalized groups to not stand together, especially when we need representation and we need numbers, you know?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just to say, that's why I love that story in Isaiah.
Yeah. I mean, I was literally just reading the other day, and like, I'm not a historian. I don't know like the full story here, but I was just reading the other day about like how like multicultural and multifaceted the like movements were in the like 1960s and 70s. Like reading about how like the Black Panthers worked with like all of these other groups that were like there was this major like Chicano rights group that was working with them, and like Asian American leaders who were working with them, and how multiracial and multifaceted, multicultural that work was. And then the way that the US government like specifically was like, well, let's find ways to like drive wedges between these communities because they're too powerful when they work together. And that's such a common narrative for like any structural power to say, you know, let's like find ways to divide and conquer. Let's find ways to separate these groups. And we're seeing it happening right now in LGBTQ plus groups, where we're seeing groups that are like, you know, LGB rights only, and let's like shove trans folks out of it. And like it's the same thing where like this is something that we need to recognize is coming from a group, like multiple people in power that feel like we're too strong when we work together. And like the idea of I don't know, I think it comes within marginalized groups. It's not that, you know, we're just bad at working together. It's that we're fighting for scraps, you know. It's that this idea of like there is no such thing as abundance. Like we have to just like, there's only so many pieces of the pie, and like if I get some, you don't. And like if we can move beyond that feeling and that experience, like it's not just a feeling, it is an experience, because we are dealing with like reduced resources right now. But like if we can recognize that we don't have to fight each other, like there's like more systems in place. Exactly.
Yeah, we always have to punch up. And honestly, I think I know that folks might think we veered wildly off course from trans theology. But for me, as a queer person, as a trans person, a non-binary person of trans experience, I try to neatly package my identity for conversational purposes.
I know.
But
tough.
as a queer person of trans experience, right? I actually think that trans theology and queer theology have a lot of bearing on this conversation, because what do trans people do, and what do non-binary and gender expansive people do on the regular? We transgress boundaries, right? And so I'm a non-binary person who is assigned female at birth and societally is read as a white male, but I know absolutely what it's like to live as a white female. And moreover, when I was visibly female, I was always visibly gay. I've never actually known what it feels like for people to assume you're heterosexual until now. And that's why I constantly out myself. But we, as queer and trans people, we understand transgressing boundaries, right? And it makes sense to extend that theological sort of treatise to transgressing boundaries of marginalization. Right? Being queer makes me a better advocate, because it makes me realize that the struggle is broad, and we have to work together beyond the binaries of just different sex. Because if we all keep fighting each other, or even if we fight the man independently, we're still out on the numbers. We're a minority. But I think trans theology shows us, and specifically that passage in Isaiah, it shows us that we're intrinsically linked as marginalized peoples. And not only are we linked and should we work together, but there's a blessing for us that we can only receive when we do work together, right? And I think that even crosses religious boundaries as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's so many like, I talk about this in the book, but like the parable of, the shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one and leaves the 99 to find the one sheep who's missing. Like there's so many different ways to read that story, but the way that I feel like that really calls to me is the reading that story as a reminder that we are not whole unless everybody is present. And like that we are stronger as a whole than we are as individuals, not just in like might, but in like in wholeness. Like we can't be whole unless everybody is whole, and we can't be whole unless everybody is here and present. And that's like such a it's something that I think is hard to remember. But it's an important story.
I love that about, so people ask me all the time why I'm still a Christian. And actually on TikTok, I get comments back because I refer to myself as reluctantly Christian. And people will be like, why do you say reluctantly? And I'm like, have you fucking met the rest of us? Like, have you?
Yeah.
The Christians don't have the best name, but if I don't stick around and be the crazy gay uncle of Christianity, who's going to be like, we need to pump the brakes here a little bit, we've lost the plot. And I think that that story, man, I love coming back to the Bible and coming back to Christianity, because for me, while my brain has grown and expanded, I still read different things when I read the text. And I've never thought about the story of the parable of the lost sheep from that angle before. And that's one of the reasons I keep coming back to Christianity. Now, I'll also read the Quran. I'm also observing Ramadan right now. I'll also go to a Seder when invited. Like I'll also attend, a Hindu gathering, whatever. But as my native language, right, I think the Bible still has a lot to say to queer people and to the situation of the world at large, but we have to set it free from these literalistic chains that evangelicals put on it. Martin Luther did a little bit of a damage to us when he said sola scriptura, because that was a fail. That was a fail, Martin Luther.
I know, it's true. Yeah, there's yes, there's so much in Christian tradition that has, like we love to blame evangelicals, but like, yeah, sola scriptura comes from Lutheranism, and like inerrant infallibility comes from Calvinism, and like, there's a lot going on in Christian tradition, but there is just as many folks in Christian tradition that help us like think beyond that, and not just like the people who are labeled as heretics. Like people in good standing in Christian tradition have like helped us think beyond this stuff. And that's, I don't know, that's one of the, coming back to sort of like finding your ancestors. It's like there's so much in Christian tradition that we can pull from. And I know, like, we have these monthly workshops at Transmission Ministry Collective where we have somebody come in and speak, and we try to have as many like trans theologians come speak as we can. And so we had Dr. Gabby Bykowski come speak to us, who's at Case Western, and she's a medievalist, and she came and she was like, here are gender expansive people in the medieval period in Christianity. Here are some trans saints. Like, it was so cool. It really was like liberatory to watch transgender expansive people go like, oh, okay, so like even within Christian tradition, like past the Bible into like early Christian traditions and medieval Christian traditions, like gender expansive people have been here, and lots of times it was like not a big deal. Realizing that like we've got tradition, we've got precedent.
Yeah, I just read, I think it's called Early Christianity and Homosexuality by John Boswell. I'm reading it for my LGBT course. And the whole thesis of his book is that like they didn't talk about queer people necessarily. There wasn't a need to say that queer people are okay because they were already okay. And the homophobia and transphobia didn't come until a later invention. I'm actually working on a research project on that right now. Surprise, everybody. You'll be hearing about that. I like to use my homework as a springboard for conversation. So that'll be forthcoming. But,
why not?
I definitely think that we really were there all along, and it was a massive PR game to honestly, I think, consolidate power and ultimately consolidate control. The more people you hate, the more easy you are to control.
Yeah,
and like, came out of my brain, and I feel like I need to write it down, but that seems really, really accurate. Like, the more people you hate, the easier you are to control, because like now any Joe Schmo who used to be a cop and is now an evangelical megachurch pastor at the church right down there. Not that I'm talking about anybody, but anybody with no education can come up and be like, hate these people. And because like, the enemy of your, friend is also your enemy, right? And so it's all of a sudden we can control this group of people because they hate. But what happens if we like expansively love people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I've seen in queer and trans communities is the way that like fear has been used. Like, and I mean, you can connect that if you want to go all Star Wars. You can do the like fear turns to anger, anger turns to hate, hate turns to whatever hate turns to. I forget, suffering. That's what it is. Thanks, Yoda. But like from what I've seen, like fear is such a strong tool for control, and it's like one of the main things that we see in communities that have high numbers of like religious or spiritual trauma, which queer and trans communities, if you're a queer or trans Christian, you probably are dealing with like spiritual trauma and religious harm. And like fear is such a base of that, because if you have been told like, here are the ways that you can step out of bounds, and if you step out of bounds, you are going to hell, you are not loved anymore, you are going to lose your whole family, all these things, like that is such a powerful mechanic of control. And so it's like, it's not just like, it's not it's like the fear is what controls people, the hate is what you are required to do in order to not be afraid. Like, if you want to stay in these bounds, you have to hate these people or else. And the or else is the thing that is so hard to work with. I think like helping, I've been realizing kind of like the way that spiritual trauma shows up in queer and trans communities and queer and trans folks is so much of it is about like the fear of not being able to trust yourself,
Mhm.
because you have been told, like, here are the people with authority, like you can't trust yourself, and you can't, like, fear around, like, fear of hell is like such a huge thing for folks. And
Mhm.
so how do we lean into trust as an antidote to fear?
Mhm.
You can only trust if you have reason to trust, right? Like, so you have to actually believe that, for instance, God is a trustworthy being.
Mhm.
And if you're going to trust a church community, you have to be able to trust, like, you have to base that on the fact that, like, they are already caring for you well, or else how are you going to trust them? So, like, that building, and like building trust in yourself. Can I trust myself? How do I build my own internal sense of trust so
Yeah.
that I can listen to my own gut when I have this feeling of, like, this religious leader feels real bad. Like, you have to be able to, like, trust your gut on that. So
Yeah.
all those things, like that building of trust with others, with God, with yourself, can be a pushback against all of the sort of fear that comes up in the midst of this spiritual trauma.
Absolutely. And there's so much, I feel like marginalized populations endure abusive environments all the time, right? And I think that if minority communities were honest, our stories are all different, right? I think sometimes when people think of the identity of queer, they think of eventually we're just going to dissolve all identities. No, I think queerness means all identities exist, but it's just equitable, right? So
Mhm.
when I say I'm queer, I don't disavow the parts of me that I've grown up with or the communities I've come from. I just acknowledge that I transcend these things. And so I don't think
Mhm.
queerness is about a lack of identity. But I think when we talk about marginalized communities, a lot of us have experienced abuse and trauma. And if we look carefully, we can see the ways in which our trauma is being used to pit us against each other. And if we can overcome that trauma, we can create better intersectional movements. And I think, to the point of your work, I think that's what trans theology does, is it helps trans people come back to a point where they're like, oh no, like I I'm not wrong and I'm not bad and I can trust myself. So there suddenly becomes a theological conversation where we can understand our own worth and our own, agency, right?
Mhm. Totally, yeah. And like yes, the movement towards being able to, like, trust yourself and trust others and trust God, like,
Mhm.
you have to build that on something. We can't
Mhm.
just ask people to do that, out of nothing. We have to have it based on something. And, like, that's, so going back to the Bible, because that's what I love to do, it, like, that's the whole thing that you see in the Psalms. It's something that you see in a lot of the prophets, where the people of Israel are being called to recall all the good things that God has done for them before, in order to help them remember that they can trust God for the future. And
Mhm.
so, like, when we're feeling like, I don't know if I can believe that this is true, or I don't know if I can believe that God really cares for me or will care for me, we can look to the past, and we can look to our own past, our own experiences. We can look throughout Christian history. We can look at the Bible. We can look at, like, our spiritual ancestors. Um, we can look for the ways that God has shown up and been faithful and loving,
Mhm.
as, like, as a remembrance of what can be.
Yeah.
And of course, there's, like, lots we have to struggle with too, because there's
Of
lots of,
course.
like, really abusive shit in the Bible too. So, like, we do
Mhm.
have to wrestle with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this sense of, like, you have to build trust on something. So,
Yeah.
like, how do we give people the tools that they need to feel like they can build that trust?
Yeah, and I think in that way, the work that you've put out and the work that you continually put out, right? It's not necessarily about apologetics to convince some. I am thoroughly uninterested in convincing people of my validity, but what I
Yeah.
am interested in is undergirding my understanding of self. And so in
Yep.
that way, it's not to prove something to somebody else, but it's literally to give me a springboard to stand on to do the work that I'm doing, right?
Right. And that's the, like, I was teaching a workshop, and I had, like, some breakout sessions where we had people discuss some different things. And one of the questions I had them discuss is, like, is apologetics still useful? Like,
Mhm.
when is it useful, or why would it still be useful? And that's, like, the number one thing, at least for me, is, like, apologetics is not something I do for cis straight folks. It's
Right.
something that I do so that we as queer and trans folks can understand ourselves, and, like,
Mhm.
be able to move from that point um I don't know, of being solid in who we are, the fact that we are loved, the fact that we can like have this basis of trust. And so like that's why apologetics is important, not because we have to convince other people, but because we have to be able to understand it ourselves.
Absolutely. I want to pull a bit of a pivot because I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. So basically, everybody, what you've heard so far is like the underlying understanding of this conversation, right? Of why trans theology matters. And if you want the nitty gritty of it, please go get Austen's book. I'm not here to recount his book because I want to expand on those thoughts, but the information is out there. Don't heckle me in the comments. If you're a hater, go read the book first. Otherwise, I'm not even going to converse with you until you've read the book. But Austen, I would love to hear your thoughts. So I just pulled up this screenshot on my phone, and this is from a husband and wife couple who were not married at the time I knew them, but they met in Bible school, right? And they posted this picture on Facebook. And I don't think they have a joint account, but they tagged each other. If it was a joint account, I probably wouldn't even entertain the conversation because joint account means someone's cheated. But
Oh no.
I'm shots fired. Sorry if you have a joint account. But so these people that I went to college with, right, conservative evangelical college, posted a post that said, it's a newspaper article that was published on April 7th through Fox News. And it said, New Jersey to require second graders to learn about gender identity in the fall, alarming parents. So that's the headline. And then the people that I went to school with posted, and this is one of the reasons why we homeschool, we love Maranatha. And I couldn't help but comment. My comment on the bottom was, you know, everybody has a gender identity, right? Not just gay people. But what do you, I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts about this as a trans person who comes from the church. But what do you think about all of this sort of conversation around this like fear of, you know, Florida as a don't say gay bill, Texas, you know, transitioning as child abuse, people being worried about learning about gender identity? What do you think that like trans theology or just your trans experience as a person, right, has to say to situations like this, especially to people who, you know, are a part of the worlds that we've come from?
I mean, I think so much of it is, I mean, it's frustrating. So much of it is dealing with intentional misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is not stuff that, this is a forward one step back of like, of communities, marginalized communities receiving like, maybe some rights or some like recognition or whatever, and then there being a huge backlash against that community because it's like, well, you need to be staying in your place, right? Like there's so this is such a common thing, and it's not, this is not a this is not weird, this is not out of the ordinary, we see this happen all the time. But like it's intentional misinformation that is like coming out about, that are like information is coming out not in good faith, information, it's not even information, it's like news articles about like little kids having surgery. Like that is not happening for trans kids. Is it happening for intersex kids? Yes, and we need to stop it, but like it's not happening for trans kids. And so like complete misinformation like that is coming out and is making people scared, because of course if you were a parent and you're like, oh my gosh, this scary thing might happen to my kid, especially without my consent, of course you're going to be scared about that, right? But it is intentionally using misinformation as a scare tactic to make people afraid, which is what we were talking about before, so that they stay in the lines of whatever it is the institution is trying to, you know, influence them to do or not do. So I don't know, I almost don't blame the folks that, like the people that are posting this kind of stuff, because they don't realize that it's misinformation. They don't realize that it's not true. And so it's like frustrating, because this is almost something that I see on a more, I blame the systems in place more than I blame the individuals that are sharing this stuff. Absolutely. Because the systems in place that are like, you know, the 24-hour news cycle that just needs something to talk about all the time, the people that need to use trans folks as a scapegoat because they don't want other stuff to come out about what they're doing, you know, like the trans stuff in Texas, the fact that that came out, that information or the stuff by the governor of Texas about like, we're going to have CPS investigate like families, which has turned out to like be a thing that's really happening. But that came out the same day that it turned out that he intentionally like upped the price on natural gas and home heating during that winter storm. Like that was an intentional move to keep the heat off of the heat, you know, off of him for that moment. So like trans folks are being used as a scapegoat in so many ways. And so I'm mad at the systems that are doing this kind of stuff. I'm also mad at the systems within Christianity and within churches that have not properly educated folks about like their siblings. The fact that we don't, I don't know how to frame this exactly, but like, so one of the things that's frustrating for people in politics right now when it comes to trans rights is that lots of sort of Republican senators and House members and representatives and like there are folks on sort of the right who are intentionally enacting anti-trans measures. There are not folks on the left, or at least not as many in the Democratic House of everything, that are trying to enact trans protective measures. Like there's not enough pushback coming from the Democratic side. The people who are spewing all the hate are louder, right? And that's frustrating. In the same way within the church, the folks that say all the anti-trans stuff when it comes to theology are loud, and the people that are affirming are not as loud, and we don't know why. Like, what is the holdup? And that's why I think so many people are mad that churches won't take a stand, and like rightfully so. The churches will be like, well, this is not something we're going to address. It's not that important to us, or we don't want to alienate people or whatever. Like churches need to take a stand on this. Because if they don't, we assume that they are not affirming. We assume that we will not be safe there. That's how minority stress works, is you assume that you are unsafe unless it is proven otherwise. And so, yeah, that's what I'm mad at in this situation, is like the systems and the failure of the systems, and the systems that are doing exactly what's intended in a malicious way.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And with that, it brings me to this like kind of question I'd love to use to sort of wrap us up or send us out or whatever. But I'll start with just like a little caveat of explanation, right? When I was in college, I was really, really struck with or fixated on, I was always super nerdy, always studying, always reading. Like that's just me. Like when I was 10, I bought a copy of A.W. Tozer's Fourfold Gospel at church camp. My brother bought Sea Monkeys. Like that's just who I am as a person. But in college, I was really fascinated with, like, I was trying to be straight. And I'm not trying to be straight, I was just like trying to be as conformist as possible. So I was like trying to study like what it means to be a woman of God, because they talk about David as a man of God, which is interesting because David was a massive asshat in a lot of ways.
In a lot of ways, yep.
But so I was trying to think about what it means to be a woman of God, or what does it mean to be a man of God. But now I find myself in this non-binary space. Talk to me about, like, what do you think the Bible says about gender identity? Like, what, if you could craft a response like to these people about gender identity based on the Bible, based on your experience, based on your exegesis, like what do you think the Bible does have to say about gender identity? And what does the Bible have to say that transcends the binary of man or woman of God?
Dang, that's so many questions. I don't know if I can answer all those. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I would put a caveat and say, I don't know how much we can say about the Bible talking about gender identity, because we cannot go back and ask people how they understood themselves. And that is what identity is about, this internal sense of understanding, right? We can look at the Bible and say, what does the Bible have to say about physical bodies? And we can look at what the Bible says about gender expression, because those are two things that, like, the Bible does speak to. It doesn't speak so much to identity, especially because we don't understand identity in the same way that they do. Yeah,
absolutely, right? Because identity just relies on some self-agency in the process of expression.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So like, but what we can say to those two other things, to bodies and like what people often talk about as like assigned sex, what we can say to that is that people have always existed outside of the binary when it comes to bodies. Like intersex folks have always existed. The way that we see intersex folks like wrapped up within the category of eunuchs in scripture is really important. We see them being affirmed. We see the fact that like people in Jesus's time knew about intersex folks and talked about them and like the way that they would fit into the society of the time. So like when we talk about diversity in bodies, I think we can definitely say like, yes, oh, that is good. You are still made in the image of God, right? This is an intentional diversity that God built into the world in a positive way. When it comes to gender expression, I think there's so much that both Jewish and Christian tradition, both the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, can say about diversity of gender expression. And even though, of course, we have, examples like Paul saying that women should keep their hair covered, and that men shouldn't have long hair, like we have an understanding of the way that that is different even within the context of the Bible, which spans several thousand years, right? So like we recognize that even when it comes to gender expression, there are other things in place that allow for differences in gender expression. We have people in the Bible who moved against understood requirements of gender expression, and that they were seen as positive examples. They were good people, right? Mm-hmm. So like when we think about diversity in expression and diversity in bodies, it's very easy to make sort of a biblical argument about why folks that express themselves differently when it comes to gender expression and folks with different bodies are affirmed and loved and intentionally made made in the fullness of what God intended, right? When it comes to like being a sort of a man of God or a woman of God or moving beyond that, like, I don't know. I think one of the most interesting conversations happening in trans faith spaces today are conversations about whether God is genderless or genderful. I love the conversation that we're having, the internal conversation that we're having about, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, like, in heaven, for instance, are we all, if you believe in heaven, are we all going to still have the genders that we have, or are we going to be without gender? Are we going to have transcended it completely? Is like gender something that needs to be sort of abolished in like the coming kingdom, or is gender something that just needs to be expanded? And having that conversation within trans communities is so cool, because you have people of all different like opinions on that. And like having like a conversation where you have like, a binary trans person, a non-binary trans person, an agender person, like that is going to influence your understanding of this. So I don't know. I think, like, is it useful to have like, this is what a man of God looks like, this is what a woman of God looks like? For some people, that is helpful. For folks that fit within the binary, that is helpful. Should we base our identity around gender always? No. Do we need to have like, here's what it's like to be a non-binary person of God? If that is helpful for you, maybe that is the thing that we need to like talk more about. For some people, it's not going to be helpful. So really, I think it comes down to like, does this help you live into love for God and love for neighbor? Then let's go for it. Does this not help you live into love for God and love for neighbor and love for yourself? Then like, maybe let's hold off on that, right? Yeah, but we don't need to throw it in the trash either, because for some people that will be helpful.
Absolutely. I love that. That's great off the top of your head answer there, friend. But you're so right with the gender expression versus gender identity, which I think is an important point. And John Boswell points that out in his book. We can't know how the eunuch viewed themselves. Right. We can, like, and that's why I made a TikTok about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and the eunuch as a trans or queer person being, and I said trans, a trans person accepted and, baptized into the church. And I should have said queer, because I think queer allows for a different level of like self identification there. So I can't transpose onto the Ethiopian eunuch that they were trans. I don't know that. I just know they were a eunuch. And I think it's really important to know too that our ancestors, that's something that people want to know about LGBTQ people in the past, but LGBTQ people didn't exist before like 1900s, tops. And really not even in the early 1900s, like that was just a pathological term, right? Like we didn't have a really community coalition, and so or coalescing. But so we have to realize,
within the context of like white America, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's my point, is that the queerness has ancestors throughout the entire world and throughout the entire history of the world. And we just need to decolonize our understanding of what LGBTQ means, and we'll find solidarity in, you know, it's like Hydra people, in the Mahu people, in the you know, in the two-spirited people. Like there's ancestors there, right?
Right. And so much of that is like figuring out how we be together without using the same language for ourselves. Because like so much of that is like, for folks in those communities, they're like, well, I wouldn't identify as LGBT, or I wouldn't use the words that you're using. I am Mahu, or, you know, like, and so how do we be in community when we are not the same is, I think, the operative question of Christianity today.
Yeah, absolutely. Within queer spaces and within, mixed spaces, right? In terms of gender and identity and faith, even is like, how do we be together effectively when we use different languages? So, not at all impractical for my interfaith and inter-ideological studies as well. So,
right.
Well, Austen, I thank you so much. I could actually quite literally talk to you for like another 10 hours and be very, like, it would be as fast as this conversation has been, because I have so many thoughts that I would love to chat with you about, but that just means we'll have to collaborate in the future in some way.
That's true.
So, but I always finish with 2 questions. And my first question is this. This is the hard one. The second one's the easy one. This is the hard one after that last one. If folks listening today were only going to remember like one thing, one sentence, one idea, what would you want them to take away from this conversation?
That is a hard question.
Just nice bite-sized compact piece.
Right, exactly. I think for trans and gender expansive folks, I would want them to take away that you are standing in a great cloud of witnesses, as we would put it in the church. That you are not alone in what you are going through. You are not alone in your identity. And you are not alone in Christian history. You're not alone in, like, your spiritual ancestors are with you. And for you to be part of that larger picture and to be part of that larger community means that you are not expendable, and that you are important, and that you can base your trust on something very real. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
Absolutely. What would you say to cis folks or allies?
I would say that if you have not found a way to be vocal about your support for trans folks before, this is a good time to start. And if you feel like you want to be supportive and you don't know how, if you have questions, like I recently talked to somebody who said, like, I want to be supportive of trans women in sports, but like I feel like I just don't know enough to even have that conversation. Like, this is a great time to learn. So like, find ways to educate yourself. If you like, nobody is going to yell at you for asking for a resource. Don't ask for an individual to like educate you on their own time, but nobody's going to be mad at you if you're just like, can you send me a resource on this, or can you tell me where to look for this? Right. Like, we will do that. So educate yourself and speak up.
I like that. Absolutely. I think that's a great point, because I've never gotten mad for somebody for asking me for a resource, period. Like, I'm never gonna be like, no, don't educate yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep.
So the second question is much easier than that one, because it requires information that you probably already have synthesized. But if people are interested in you, interested in your work, interested in the Transmission Collective, anything like that, how can people find you, engage with you, follow you?
You can find me, my website is austenhartke.com, which is, I should spell it AUSTENHARTKE.com. And you can find me there for my stuff. And you can find all of the things around Transmission Ministry Collective at transmissionministry.com. So if you're a trans or gender expansive person that wants to talk with other folks in support groups or in workshops or on a Discord or wherever, you are more than welcome there. And yeah, if you want to check out Transforming, the book that I wrote, you can just search Transforming and my name in pretty much anywhere, and you'll be able to find it.
All right, awesome. Thank you. I will list those things in the show notes as well when I go to post this. Do my best to signal boost, because that's literally what this is about. So Austen, I do thank you so much. I really genuinely hope we can collaborate and work together in the future, because I think a lot of who I am as a person and authentically coming out of that, what I do aligns with your work. And I would love to collaborate with you in any way possible. Thank you so much for your time and energy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely. And everybody who's watching, thank you so much for coming to Conversations. Like I said, we come together regularly and intentionally to have spiritually minded conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. And absolutely everybody's voice is not only welcomed, but needed at the table. We'll see you at our next episode. Austen, have a great day. See you later, everybody.
This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.